Thank you. I think first I'm going to ask if someone can help me with the turning this back on. I'll talk into the top. I just need some help with the screen since it was set up, so I think we just need to...
There we go. It's just a matter of waking it up. Do you need help?
No, I'll just turn this way. Okay, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great. Wenona Singel and Dishnakas, Waganak Kising Odawa and Donjaba, Wabanong Nakwejang and Dian Nongam. My name is Wenona Singel, and I'm a member of the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians, and I currently live in East Lansing, Michigan. So it's my honor to be here with all of you today to talk about the right to vote and Michigan Indians. And first, I thought it would be helpful if I gave you some context about Michigan tribal communities and Michigan Native people. So I'm going to start with some information about that. Okay, so introduction to Michigan's Native populations. And there we go. So in Michigan, we have 12 federally recognized Indian tribes. So these tribes are located, 5 of them in the Upper Peninsula and 7 of them in the Lower Peninsula. And in this map, you can see in the state of Michigan, they're the red circles. So we have several in both the Northwest Lower Peninsula as well as the Southwest area of Michigan, including in exactly mid-Michigan in the Mount Pleasant area, the Saginaw Chippewa tribe. And then, of course, we have 5 tribes in the Upper Peninsula throughout the UP on the western and eastern sides of the UP. And of course, a little bit of census data. You can see that the population of Michigan Indians is about 0.7% of Michigan in terms of the Michigan's population. If you look at people who identify as American Indian or Alaska Native alone, and 1.4% if you consider that population of those who identify as American Indian or Alaska Native alone or in combination with another race. And also what you can see in terms of Michigan relative to the rest of the country is that we don't have as many counties where there's a significant proportion of the county population that is Native compared to other areas of the western United States. But you can see that if you look at American Indians alone or in combination with other races, that those counties with the highest proportion of Native people is located in the Upper Peninsula. And then if you look at people who identify alone or in combination, meaning they identify as American Indian or Alaska Native alone or in combination with another race, there are more counties in Michigan, including in the northwest part of Michigan, where the counties have a higher proportion of the population that identifies as Native. Now that said, what's really interesting too is that the highest population center for Native people in terms of raw numbers rather than as a proportion of the county is actually in the Detroit area. So our largest populations of American Indians in Michigan are in Detroit, Lansing, and Grand Rapids. And then in addition, I want to also just highlight that the Michigan is made up culturally of 3 groups. We have the Odawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi. So each of the 12 federally recognized tribes are made up of one or a combination of those groups. And the language that's common to all 3 of those cultural groups is called Anishinaabe-Moan. And there are distinct dialects of it. And so you might hear a dialect of it called Ojibwe or the dialect of Odawa. There are many things in common across those dialects. And of course, in the Anishinaabe-Moan language, we have important cultural concepts that are taught within our communities. And so one of the most important of those is what's called Minno-B'Madzuin. And Minno-B'Madzuin simply means the good life. And so I'll show more about that in a moment. But I just want to show this because it also reflects a different philosophy of looking at the world and our relationship to it. for many people who are Native, they consider themselves to be in relation to their entire surroundings. So they may first recognize their immediate family, then their extended family, their tribal community, their broader community as well, and then of course the entire universe. And even the natural world that surrounds us is in relationship to us and has a form of kinship. So what I want to focus on also is that, to live a life, to live the good life, it's important to live in accordance with what we call the 7 grandfather teachings. And that's important to the Odawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi, all 3 of which are called together the Anishinaabe. And so the 12 grandfather teachings consist of wisdom, love, respect, bravery, honesty, humility, and truth. And I also have the Anishinaabe term for each of those. So this is very similar to, say, the 10 Commandments, but these are the principles that we have to live by in order to live a good life. And so I think it's very important to recognize that there's a completely different worldview and different cultural teachings that are important for the Anishinaabe in Michigan. Now, what I also want to emphasize as well is some of the history surrounding Michigan tribes. And so this, of course, is a map of the treaty sessions in the state of Michigan. And that history is very important to Native people. So I'll show, first of all, we do have a history of treaties. The federal government entered into more than 400 treaties with tribes throughout the United States, and those treaties were ratified by Congress. And so of those, we also have several treaties that were entered into with Michigan's Native peoples. And so, for example, the pink area in the eastern UP and in the northern part of the Lower Peninsula, that's an area that was ceded or relinquished, if you will, by the Treaty of 1836. And so the area in green that surrounds the crook of the thumb is actually from ceded or relinquished by the Treaty of 1819. And so we had a commemoration of that in Michigan just last year. And so what the treaties did is a number of things. They involved the relinquishment of Native title, which included a right of use and occupancy of the land to the federal government in exchange for compensation and other promises, such as education of Native children and other goods and services that were provided in kind to the tribes. But that's not to say that the treaty negotiations were fair and fully just, because as you know, throughout history, there were many instances in which the treaties were negotiated with absolute imbalance of power. And in many cases, the federal government had not yet complied with the promises of prior treaties before demanding new cessions of land from Native people. And of course, that included in Michigan as well. So for example, when Lewis Cass was charged with negotiating for the Treaty of 1819 cession from Michigan Indians, he wrote a letter to the president and said, "We haven't yet paid for the last treaty cession from the Indians, and so I know that the tribes will refuse to make any new cessions unless they receive payment. So I'm taking the money out of my own bank account to make that payment, and I trust that I'll be compensated and reimbursed for that," so that he could negotiate the new treaty terms. And so that often occurred. Elsewhere in the United States, there are often rations and food and annuities would be withheld from the tribes to persuade them to require and pressure them to agree to new treaty cessions. So that also occurred. In addition, treaties were negotiated in English, not in native languages, or they were negotiated in a trade language which had a very limited lexicon of terms. And so it did not allow for deep understanding and a true meeting of the minds between tribal members and the federal government. Okay, so One of the things that Michigan's history of treaty cessions gave rise to is the expectation that Native people would be removed from the state of Michigan. I know you probably heard of the Cherokee Trail of Tears, where the Trail of Tears had affected the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole tribes, but not many people learn about the history of removal in Michigan. In fact, one of the fathers of the concept of removal was Isaac McCoy, and he was a missionary in the state of Michigan with Michigan Indians. And so there was an expectation that Michigan would be cleared of Native people to make way for settlement by non-Natives. And one of the examples of that is the commission of General Hugh Brady of the U.S. military. And he was charged with forcibly removing Michigan Indians from the southern areas of the state in 1840. And so it's fascinating to see not only the documentation at the federal level in the National Archives of his commission, but also other evidence that exists, for example, in Michigan's Pioneer and Historical Accounts. You can see local settlers documenting their observation of General Hugh Brady's troops rounding up Michigan Indians and preparing for their forced removal west of the Mississippi. And so you can see, for example, that here in Lansing, we have the Turner Dodge House, and one of the sisters of the Turner Dodge family was a teacher in a school, and she wrote, "I've seen hundreds of Native people in Mason pass along both sides of her school." And her and the students were initially frightened, but she wrote in her journal that later they recognized that these were Native people who were fleeing General Brady's troops. There are also documented statements by settlers in the area of Marshall, Michigan, writing that on the Kalamazoo River there was a promontory next to a creek's confluence with the Kalamazoo River, and that there was a camp, a forced encampment of Native people that had been rounded up by General Brady's troops, and who were awaiting removal. And so these stories exist in our surroundings, and yet we don't often hear about them. It's also true in Owasso, for example, that it's known in Owasso's local history that there was another forced holding location for Michigan Indians who had been rounded up by General Brady's troops in the center of town, and the city of Owasso continues to recognize that location. So this history is documented and recorded, but not something that we share in our schools or teach in our public education system. Many Michigan Indians survived by fleeing toward northern Michigan or to areas in Canada. And so in fact, we have deep connections, familial connections with the reserves in Ontario, such as the reserve at Wikwemikong on Manitoulin Island in Lake Huron, or in the reserves in southern Ontario. And so much later, after removal, we had many Michigan tribal members move back from Ontario back to Michigan. And to this day, for example, we have Michigan Anishinaabe in Lansing who speak Anishinaabemowin, but who are not recognized as eligible for enrollment in a Michigan federally recognized tribe because their family was in Ontario at the time of the census that became the document that limited who could be considered Indian. So this history is very complex, and it works in some cases to exclude people from recognition. So this is just a map, and it shows the location of the forced removal from Michigan. The Nottawasepi Huron-Band of Potawatomi is one of Michigan's 12 federally recognized tribes. They have a reservation in Athens, Michigan, and they have tribal members who experienced that removal with General Brady. And then in the case of Chief John Moguago, it's documented that he escaped partway on this forced removal journey, came back to Michigan, and was able to help establish the Pine Creek Reservation that the tribe currently occupies. So he's one of the survivors. And there are many individuals who actually experienced removal, but then after collecting an annuity in Kansas, for example, came back. And so removal was not successful in the sense that Michigan tribal members would often come back after having participated in that. And so, for example, I've looked at what are called muster rolls, so the names of tribal members who are documented as arriving in Kansas with a group of forced removal people. And I see Okemos' name in that forced removal list. And so Okemos, of course, the word Okemos simply means Ogama, leader or chief. And what I think is really sweet is Okemos with the S is really the diminutive. So Okemos means little chief. I don't know that many people in the city of Okemos recognize that. And it's actually quite funny to say Chief Okemos because you're just saying chief at that point. And this is a handwritten account of a store owner from Lucius Buell Holcomb. He owned a store in Athens, Michigan, and he wrote about 15 pages documenting how he accompanied General Hugh Brady's troops on this forced removal to Kansas. And so I saw many references, citations to his journal entry describing his participation in removal. I ultimately was able to find the document. The document was in the Battle Creek Historical Society records in the basement of a mental health hospital in Battle Creek. But these are important parts of our history. That's right. And of course, Leopold Pokagon of the Pokagon Band, the Potawatomi Indians, they also experienced the pressure to remove, but they were successful in negotiating an addendum to a treaty which secured their ability to remain in Michigan. And what many Michigan Indians did to survive and remain in Michigan is they claimed that they had they had converted to Christianity. And so Leopold Pokagon had converted to Catholicism with his band. And that was one way that tribes would claim that they had become civilized so they could remain in the state of Michigan. And so when he was confronted by General Brady's troops, he actually consulted, not in court, but out of court, with the Michigan Supreme Court Justice Epaphroditus Ransom, who confirmed, yes, the tribe had a legal right to remain in the state because of the addendum to the treaty that reserved their ability to stay in the state. Mm-hmm. So this history is absolutely important to Michigan Indians. What many people also don't recognize is the pressure to remove their lands, even for tribal members who did not face removal. And so in this case, the Burt Lake Burnout is an important part of Michigan Indian history, and this represents an instance where the tribe, the Burt Lake Band, one of the historic bands of Little Traverse Bay bands, they actually gave up on the attempt to hold on to Indian country reservation land, so they purchased their own land, fee simple title, and then they transferred their property ownership directly to the governor of Michigan at the time. The governor accepted that property and agreed to hold it in trust for the benefit of the band. That's exactly what the Nottawasepi Huron Band did with their Pine Creek Reservation after John Mogowago returned to Michigan. Well, in the case of Burt Lake, the community maintained for many years that that property was exempt from local property taxes, since it was held by the governor of the state for their benefit. But that opinion shifted over time so that it was later believed in the surrounding community that the property was subject to property taxes. It was ultimately sold at a tax foreclosure sale and purchased by a lumber speculator named John McGinn. And so when the tribe refused to leave their village, the lumber speculator worked with the local sheriff of Sheboygan County, Fred Ming, and together they lit the entire village on fire with kerosene. And so this is a community that was a village that was completely burned to the ground, with the exception of the church. And that occurred on October 15th of 1900. It was widely reported at the time as well. What I find interesting is in many cases, the local newspapers had headlines such as "Lo, the poor Indian," as though these were hapless tribal members who were not sophisticated enough to know how to hold on to their title. But the reality was that the local tribal members had become the founders of their local township, and they had elected themselves supervisor of their township. If you look at the historic records in the newspaper, you can see the minutes where tribal members attended their own meetings. But as the opinion shifted over time, they lost their foothold in township management to non-native settlers, and then ultimately lost their land to this tax foreclosure and then burnout. And so these are two of my own ancestors, Antoine and Sophia Shenanigans, my third great grandparents, who lived at Burt Lake when the burnout occurred, and with their families, with their younger generations as well. The next thing I want to focus on is the history of child separation in Michigan history. And what you can see is a photograph of children, native children, who were, whose hair was cut at an Indian boarding school. And so the history of that includes Michigan history. So in Mount Pleasant, Michigan, we have one of the many Indian boarding schools that was created by the federal government. And so this is a photograph of the Mount Pleasant Indian boarding school. You can see the regimentation in the students. And the purpose of these schools was expressly articulated by Colonel Richard Pratt, who was the father of the Indian boarding school policy in the United States. And it was to kill the Indian and save the man. And so it was an idea that if you took Native children away from their families, they would no longer be under the influence of tribal culture and life ways, and you could teach them in a regimented militaristic school to be civilized. And the Indian boarding schools would take before and after photographs of the children. And so this is one example of a before photograph and after photograph of the same individual after their hair was cut and they were clothed in a school uniform. And so in these Indian boarding schools, children were not allowed to speak their native language. They were only allowed to speak English. They could not communicate with their family members. In many cases, they were not allowed to return home for the summer. And this includes in Mount Pleasant. I went to the National Archives to look at the records of children at the Mount Pleasant School, and there are many letters from parents saying, "Can I please have my child back during the summer?" If the parent couldn't afford the train fare to return home for the summer, the child would be assigned to a local family, and they were called outings. And an outing simply meant that the child was assigned to a family to work as a housekeeper or a governess in the local family in the community in Mount Pleasant. And so this was a practice of boarding schools throughout the United States, Indian boarding schools, and it also occurred in Mount Pleasant. So you can see these are the locations of the 25 federal Indian boarding schools throughout the United States. In addition to these boarding schools, of course, there are also many more Indian boarding schools in the U.S. that were supported by missions. And so there were Catholic and Baptist and other denominations of Indian boarding schools. And those schools also would be eligible for federal funding. But these are the 25 that were explicitly created by Congress, created by the federal government. So the one in Mount Pleasant operated until 1934. But an example of one of the Catholic Indian boarding schools is the children who attended Holy Childhood School of Jesus boarding school in in Harbor Springs, Michigan. And this school operated from 1829 to 1983. It's one of the longest operating Indian boarding schools in the country. And here are boys and girls who attended the school. One of the problems, of course, that's inherent in separating children from their families and forcing them to attend these institutions is they are not protected by their families. And so in many cases, when the children became adults, in some cases elders, they would open up and talk of stories of horrific abuse physical and sexual abuse that they experienced while they were students in these schools. And here's a photograph of the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. So you can see the faces of these children, regimented, separated from their families. Many Native children from Michigan attended the Carlisle Indian School. Michigan Native children did not just attend Mount Pleasant. In fact, one of the express policies of the Indian boarding school era was to separate children as far as possible from their families. And so they attended schools in Oklahoma, in Kansas, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, throughout the United States. And in many cases, the parents did not want the child to attend Indian boarding school. So at the Haskell Indian boarding school in Kansas, they found these child-size handcuffs, which demonstrated the restraint that children lived within as they were being removed from their families or as punishment for attempting to speak their language or run away to return home. And here's are my own grandparents with my children, Emmett, who is blonde, and Owen, who's the brunette. And so this is my mother, Laureen Peters, and my grandfather, Hank Shenaniquet, and they both attended the Holy Childhood Boarding School in Harbor Springs, Michigan. So one of the outcomes of this era was that children who grew up in Indian boarding schools did not learn the skills of parenthood from their communities and homes. And so as adults, they were often vulnerable and experienced further separation, this time from their own children. And so in the 20th century, by 1978, it was documented before Congress that 25 to 33% of Indian children were separated from their families. And so they were placed into foster care or adopted. So in many cases, that might be a child who grew up in an Indian boarding school without their family, became a parent, and may have also, because of the trauma, experienced self-medication. In many cases, children did not learn employable skills as adults, although the truth was Indian boarding schools focused on teaching menial skills to the children. I had one friend in college whose father attended an Indian boarding school, and when he graduated, he was told that he was trained to become a gas station attendant. So also, adoption and foster care were considered less costly than the federal Indian boarding school policy. It was cheaper to place children into foster care than to institutionalize them for their childhood. Also, tribes were viewed as incapable of caring for their own children, and there was high rates of removal and placement by public and private agencies. In 16 states in 1969, 85% of Indian children were placed in non-Indian homes. So that shows just how extensive it was. And so Congress did respond in 1978 by passing the Indian Child Welfare Act, which we call ICWA. And it imposes procedural protections to ensure that the tribe is notified of a child who is subject to a proceeding for a removal. And it also provides for placement preferences, and it requires that active efforts be undertaken to restore the relationship between the family and the child that's been removed. So nevertheless, in spite of the passage of ICWA in 1978, Native children continued to be highly overrepresented in the child welfare system. And here's my own mom and my Aunt Sherry. And so they were also taken in by Catholic Social Services along with all of their siblings when they were when my mother was an infant. My mother lived in foster care until she was 5 years old, and then when she was 5, she was adopted. And she was one of the in many cases, children who were adopted by non-Native families that did not know about their tribe or culture and didn't maintain a connection for them. In the case of my mother, I asked my grandmother, who adopted her, if I could have copies of the documents, the records, the court records that were associated with the adoption. And she laughed and said there were no court records, there were no legal documents. So another thing I want to highlight is that in spite of many of these challenges, tribal communities since the 1970s have been thriving in a federal era that promotes tribal self-determination and self-governance. And so since the 70s, that's been the express policy of the federal government and of Congress. So a few things. Tribes do have what we call sovereignty, that inherent power to engage in self-governance. However, it's viewed as dependent. So the Supreme Court has called tribes domestic dependent nations. This is the headquarters of the Gun Lake tribe, one of Michigan's tribes. This is the police, fire, and court building of the Saginaw Chippewa tribe in Mount Pleasant. And also, as early as 1832, the U.S. Supreme Court had affirmed tribal powers of self-governance. And also, I want to highlight that powers of self-governance are not a gift from the federal government, not a delegation from another higher source. Tribal powers of self-governance are powers that are inherent, that they've possessed since time immemorial, that they've never completely lost. And of course, there is some Indian law in the U.S. Constitution, but the Constitution does not comprehensively describe the relationship between tribes and the federal government. What it does do is refer to how under the Commerce Clause, Congress has power to regulate commerce with the Indian tribes. And that's been interpreted to mean that Congress has what we call plenary authority in Indian affairs, meaning full authority to legislate in Indian affairs to the exclusion of the states. And of course, there's the importance of the Supremacy Clause, so that if there is a conflict, say, between a state law and a tribal treaty right, the tribal treaty right prevails, since the tribal treaty right is considered part of the supreme law of the land. And tribes have what is called sovereign immunity. It's an attribute of sovereignty, which simply means that like states and like the federal government, tribes cannot be hailed into court unless one of two things occurs. Either Congress authorizes the lawsuit or the tribe waives that sovereign immunity. And also I want to emphasize that tribes do have their own legal systems. They develop them individually, independently, and many of them are unique. But in Michigan, they tend to have 3 separate branches of government, much like the state and federal governments. Okay, so sorry for the long, I'll wrap up. But
No, sorry, 10 minutes.
I have 10 minutes, good. Sorry for the long introduction.
It's very important.
But let's talk a little bit about Indian voting rights. Here's a cartoon from Harper's Weekly, where there's a person saying "move on" to a tribal member who wanted to vote. And so what's important here is to recognize that from the earliest days of U.S. history, Native people were not considered U.S. citizens, and they were not considered electors who had the right to vote. And this was reflected in the original U.S. Constitution. So the Constitution, in apportioning representatives among the various states, had said that those representatives would be based on the free members of each of the states, excluding Indians not taxed. Meaning, if you had an Indian and they were not paying taxes, they were not considered an individual, they were not a civilized person who was eligible, and they were not considered a U.S. citizen either. And what surprises some people is even with the adoption of the 14th Amendment after the Civil War, again, the language for apportionment continued to refer to the exclusion of Indians not taxed. So while the right to vote was formally extended to African Americans, it was still denied for people who were Native. And I mentioned earlier that Congress is deemed to have plenary affairs and plenary power in Indian affairs. So this gave rise to this debate. So first I want to say that during the period of the 14th Amendment, Michigan Senator Jacob Howard had said in 1866 he wasn't yet prepared to pass a sweeping act of naturalization by which all the Indian savages, wild or tame, belonging to a tribal relation would become his fellow citizens and go to the polls and vote. So that was the sentiment at that time after in 1866. So in 1884, it was affirmed by the U.S. Supreme Court that the 14th Amendment did not establish the right to vote for American Indians. And so they did not acquire citizenship upon their birth, and instead it required an act of Congress for them to have a U.S. citizenship. And so that act was passed by Congress in 1924. And here's a photograph of Calvin Coolidge with tribal members upon the signing of the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. But one of the things that's important to note is that while citizenship was formally extended to all Native people in 1924, nevertheless, states still had an important role to play. States had the right to determine who could vote in elections. And so there were many states that continued to deny the right to vote for Native people through much of the 20th century. Michigan was different. Michigan, as early as 1850, had recognized that every civilized male inhabitant of Indian descent, a native of the U.S. and not a member of any tribe, shall be an elector. This was very limited because you had to disclaim any association with an Indian tribe in order to be, and of course you had to be a male, a civilized male to be able to vote. So still this predominant notion that Native people who are connected to their tribal communities are savages who should not have the right to vote. There's an interesting story that I recall from Alaska with a famous Native family of many Native lawyers called the Paul family. And in one case, their grandmother was, she was tried in a criminal trial for encouraging an Alaska Native friend of hers to vote. And the law had prohibited Alaska Natives from voting in Alaska. And so at the trial of the grandmother, one of the issues for the jury to decide was whether the friend that she encouraged to vote was civilized. And so they wrote about how one of the things that their lawyer did in court was what they referred to it as the toilet paper test. They established that the Alaska Native friend that she encouraged to vote used toilet paper in the bathroom, and that was one of the marks that they were a civilized person and able to vote. So Alaska was through much of the 20th century had Jim Crow-like laws that were extremely restrictive for Alaska Native people. Furthermore, in Michigan, the right to vote was also denied to individuals who still claimed that they had treaty rights to hunt and fish. Of course, that's no longer the case, and tribal members do have protected treaty rights in Michigan. And in some of the last cases of states to recognize the native right to vote included New Mexico. In 1962, they finally had the New Mexico Supreme Court held that the Navajo Nation tribal members were entitled to vote in state elections. And it was also in 1962 that Utah finally recognized that Native people had the right to vote in elections. And then, in addition to that, and I won't go into a lot of detail, unfortunately, but I'm sure you've probably seen many news stories about current challenges that Native people face. So one of the examples is in North Dakota, where the state passed a law requiring that not only do you have to have an ID at the polls to vote, but it has to have a residential street address. And for many of the reservations In North Dakota, people simply have a post office box. They don't have a residential street address. And so the court this has been challenged in court, and the tribes have lost. So the Native American Rights Fund has lost in its attempt to challenge that state law. And in addition to that, there are other instances where polling locations are located extremely far from Native communities. So there are many instances in the Dakotas and in both in Arizona and Utah where individuals have to travel for hours to get to the polling location. And so the Navajo Nation has a lawsuit that it's brought in the state of Utah called Navajo Nation versus Reagan, in which is challenging the incredible difficulty, the difficulty posed by having such few polling locations in the state that it takes hours, sometimes 3 hours to get to the polling location. So, so those are some of the current challenges that exist. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate the ability to speak to all of you.
Thank you so much, Wenona. I think there are many of us who have our jaws down on the table at this point, not being aware of some of the things that we just heard. We have about 5 minutes for questions.
I have a question about the census.
Yes.
What I've been reading, I'm a census person for our league. What I've been reading is that many Native American communities are undercounted historically, and I want to know what's being done to make sure that Michigan Native American communities are counted in the census.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, there's an estimate that there are 1 million Native people who are undercounted on the census. And in Michigan, Governor Whitmer established a complete census count committee, and that includes Emily Proctor. She's, in addition to being a tribal council legislative leader for Little Traverse Bay Bands, she's also works for MSU Extension, where she helps facilitate education in tribal communities. And so she's connected throughout Indian country in Michigan and brings that knowledge and those relationships and that insight into her role to help ensure that our census is as inclusive as possible and as accurate as possible.
Thank you, because Kerry Eversole spoke to the league in the fall, and we got an overview of the efforts being made at the state level. I wanted to hear about the particular focus, because particular communities have lower counts than others.
Right, thank you.
I think Carol was next here.
Yep.
Michigan tribes, I can't remember how many different treaties are involved with establishing the rights to hunt and fish. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, what the realization of those rights has meant to the tribes and the peoples involved.
It's extremely important to tribal communities. One of the points that I did not bring up is that tribal treaty rights to hunt, fish, and gather apply coextensively with the ceded or relinquished territory. So they're not only exercised on the reservation that the treaty establishes, but they continue to exist in the ceded relinquished area. So that means both the relinquished area of the Great Lakes in terms of the Great Lakes fishery, and it also includes inland areas. Now, 2 treaties that have been litigated that have given rise to judicially recognized treaty rights include the Treaty of 1836, the one on the eastern half of the UP and the northern Lower Peninsula, and the Treaty of 1842, which is the western half of the Upper Peninsula. So for those tribes that are the original signatories to the treaties, for the Treaty of 1836, it's 5 tribes. For the Treaty of 1842, it's many, because it also includes Michigan tribes as well as tribes in Wisconsin and Minnesota as well. but it can mean the ability to engage in activities important for subsistence and for livelihood. It means the ability to engage in activities which are important for cultural reproduction, and so continuity with cultural practices and the teachings that are associated with those practices. For the Sault Ste. Marie tribe, Chairman Aaron Paymont says, for example, that the tribe was told that many, many generations ago it was traveling, and it was told that it would continue to travel until it found food that grows on the water, meaning monomen, which is wild rice. And so, and also that the tribe would be able, even in times of the greatest hardship, be able to support itself with fishing. And so it's absolutely important economically, as well as culturally and spiritually to the tribes to be able to exercise those treaty rights.
One more question and then we'll wrap up.
Is accessibility a problem in Michigan?
Accessibility to the polling locations?
Yes.
I think that it's not as much of a problem as some of the areas in the United States, like Utah and Arizona. However, we also have many individuals who don't have their own car transportation, who live well below the poverty level and who need assistance. And so that can absolutely become a barrier then to accessing the right to vote.
Are there polling places on reservations?
Yes, so in Michigan, reservation boundaries have changed over time. There's a treaty of 1836 and a treaty of 1855, and promises were made by the federal government that the government did not then fulfill. And so they created some ambiguity about what happened to the reservation boundaries that were originally established. But those areas include highly populated areas such as Petoskey, Harbor Springs, Traverse City, Leelanau Peninsula, Mount Pleasant. And so for some tribes, those are somewhat resort rural areas. But for tribes in the Upper Peninsula, there can be resources that do require significant travel in order to access locations. So that can be an issue, I would think more likely in the Upper Peninsula. But there is a movement called Native Vote, and we have tribal members who are members of the various tribes in Michigan who are actively part of Native Vote, ensuring that we maximize registration of voters as much as possible and ensure that there's access to the polls. And so who are involved in get out the vote efforts. And so the rise of the Native Vote effort has also been very important as well.
Thank you so much, Wenona. It has just been delightful. Thank you.